Hello my quilting friends! Leah Day here with a new video for the Machine Quilting Block Party. Today we're piecing block number 2 and it is an 8-petal Dresden plate. Really cute, and it's going to be super easy to piece and applique. So let's get started first cutting out these shapes accurately and then piece them together. The first step to piecing this block is to cut your tumbler shapes. And I have included a special tumbler template here. It's a cutting template that you can cut out and put together. And there's another video on how to do this to create a nice rigid cutting template. An alternative to this is to pick up the Dresden Plate template set at leahday.com, which comes with this cutting template, so you can cut these really easily. So what we're going to do is we're going to take these tumbler shapes and we're going to turn them into petals, and this is what they'll look like whenever they're finished. They have this beautiful pointy edge that is actually turned, and you can see there's a seam line straight down the middle, and this was turned outward. It's a super simple process. It's not time consuming at all, and it creates this beautiful perfect finish. So the very first step is to take your tumbler shapes and to fold them in half right sides together. Now I'm just going to line this up here and fold it right sides together. We're going to take this to the sewing machine and we're going to stitch along this edge 1/4 inch away. And I always like to feed these through the machine so that the fold is the first thing you stitch into. So that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to fold all of these in half, and you might even want to give these a little press with your iron so that way they're nice and flat, folded in half, and then they're all ready to go. So I'm at my machine, I'm just making sure that the straight edge is aligned. I'm going to slip it right underneath my presser foot and start stitching. Now, this is one thing that's unusual with these. Sometimes I like to backstitch right at that fold. That's pretty much the only time that I backstitch is when I'm working on Dresden plates. And I would have to say it's completely optional, but I just like that little extra bit of stitching because this is going to end up being the point of the Dresden plate. And I think a little bit of extra stitching kind of helps to reinforce it. So I get started, I slip the piece under the foot, I take about 2 stitches on, 2 stitches backwards, and then stitch on down. And I'm just making sure that I'm stitching with a nice 1/4 inch seam allowance, and that's going to produce a perfect Dresden petal. Once the petals have been stitched across the top, I take my scissors and just trim off this area right near the fold, and that just eliminates a little bit of that seam allowance, which can get a little bulky because this is going to be the point of our Dresden plate. The next step is to open out the seam allowance. So I just stick my thumbs in it and just press that flat, and then I turn the whole thing right side out, just like that. Now to get that point nice and pointy, I like to use a blunt object just to poke at it a little bit. The tips of your scissors, if you put your scissors together like this, then usually that's okay to use. A point turner is probably the best thing because I have a blunted tip, but this will work. So it's nice and flat. And then once I get it at this point, I place it on my pressing board. And this is one of those things, I really like to form a nice symmetrical Dresden plate shape. So part of the reason why I press the petal shape in half to start with is it creates this nice crease line so that I can line up that seam line with that crease line, and then I have a nice symmetrical Dresden plate shape. Just hold that in place and then grab your iron, give it a little press, flip it over, give it a little press, and that's how you create your petals. So you want to create a total of 4 purple petals and a total of 4 blue petals, and now we're going to arrange them together to create our Dresden plate. So here is the Dresden plate arranged. I call this the Pointy Eight Dresden Plate because we've got 8 pointy petals. So I like to piece Dresdens in sets of 4, so we're piecing 1/4 of the plate at a time. So I separate the petals out like this and then flip them over. We're going to take them to the machine, align this top side, and stitch from that folded edge down to the end. So I'm aligning those edges nicely. I'm going to slip them right underneath the foot. And again, I like to back stitch here. I'm going to take 2 stitches and 2 stitches back. It's just a tiny bit of back stitching, but I really do think that it locks those together right on that edge. This is the outer edge of the Dresden plate, and then it's appliqued in place. So having that little bit of lock stitching, I think is kind of nice. So stitch on down, and I always stitch from the folded edge to the inside. It's pretty much consistent throughout. Unless I'm doing a really funky edge to my Dresden plate, unless I'm changing up this fold at the top, I pretty much always stitch from the outside to the inside. So line it up and make sure to align this outer edge with the edge of your presser foot, and all of your petals will come together perfectly. Now I just realized I made a mistake and I want to share it with you. It's really easy to do this. When I just grabbed some petals, the first set I went through had purple on top, the second set had blue. Well, if you notice, once you unfold these, they don't come out the same and they're not really transferable. I'm going to end up with two purple next to each other. So watch out for that. Whenever you stack up your Dresden plates, always make sure that they have one color on the bottom and the same color on top, and that way they'll create that really nice, back and forth, blue, purple pattern. I'm going to have to rip this seam and take that back out again. No big deal, but I wanted to share it with you just in case that happens to you too. The reason I like to piece this Dresden plate in sets of 2 is because it forms a quarter of the Dresden plate shape, and I can put my ruler on top and I can trim it up to make sure that this angle is 90 degrees. So what I'm going to do here is line up the 45-degree line in that seam line that we've just stitched, and then I'm double checking these sides. So I basically pull the ruler out until it's right at the edges of the sides, and I check to see that they're straight. And they pretty much are, but this one's just ever so slightly off. So I'm going to trim up that side. I'm going to press firmly and rotate my ruler around and double check this side, and that looks great. So just double check, just take that little bit of time to double check that the angle created here is 90 degrees, and that's going to ensure that all of the petals come together and form a nice, flat, perfect Dresden plate. So I'm just aligning these shapes, making sure those edges are in good alignment. Slide it underneath my presser foot, 2 stitches on, 2 stitches back, and then stitch on down. I'm just making sure that the edge of my presser foot stays in line with the edges of those pieces. That way I'm forming a nice accurate 1/4 inch seam. And then I can grab the next 2 pieces, just line those up nicely, and do the exact same thing. 2 stitches on, 2 stitches back, and then stitch on down. I usually don't stop and press this seam allowance open because I've already trimmed these pieces and I know that they're accurate. I know that they're exactly 90 degrees each. So I just go straight into piecing the 2 halves together. So I'm lining up one edge and I'm just making sure those folded edges are nicely aligned. Stitch a bit, do a bit of back stitching, and then when it gets this big, it does start to get a little tricky to keep those edges in alignment. So just watch out for that as you stitch down this middle seam. I find that the top fabric usually likes to kind of pull back a little bit, so you have to nudge it into place. And it would be really easy to just start stitching from here, but I find that can be challenging and your edges can get off where the Dresdens don't end up lining up properly. So when I get to the middle, instead, I stitch onto a scrap charger here and then flip the whole piece around and align and work from the outer edge, just exactly the same way that we've done before. It's a little bit of an extra step and it might be hard to remember, but I do think that this ends up really making our Dresden plate look great. Once you get all of your petals sewn together, take some time to finger press these seam allowances open and then press with a hot, dry iron. And your block should be setting completely flat. Your Dresden plate should be setting completely flat and look just like this. And the cool thing is we have 2 different effects here. If you set it like this, you almost get a square and a square effect. I love that. we are going to applique it to our background like this so it looks more like a Dresden plate. So now let's prepare the background of our block. So here's the block background, and all I've done is taken that background square and I've pieced the border strips to the top and bottom and then to both sides. Super, super simple piecing. And now you want to take it and fold it in half, both lengthwise and widthwise, and give this a little press so that way you create crease lines. This is going to help us line up our Dresden plate so that way it's centered nicely in the block. Once you have those crease lines in place, then you're going to set your block on top, and we're going to line up these seam lines within the Dresden plate with those crease lines we've just created. So you just want to line that up, because if you've got that seam line lined up here in the middle and this seam line lined up here in the middle too, well, then the block is nicely centered. Once you get the block centered up the way you like it, then you can just pin it in place, and I've just used some straight pins here. You can also then glue it down, and that way it's not going to shift or wiggle while we're stitching around it. A couple different options for glue. Elmer's glue is an option I use quite a lot, and you know, different quilters have different opinions about it, but I think it's just fine to use Elmer's glue. The only problem is it's hard to find a really fine glue tip. This is the finest one I could find at my local quilt shop or at the office supply store, and that's really not good control. I'm going to end up using way too much glue and it'll get really goopy and kind of make a mess. So while I like using it, sometimes it's hard to control. Another option is to go with an actual quilting glue. This is Roxanne's Glue Based It, and that's an option for you. My bottle's real worn out, so I wanted to show you what the real package should look like and not my chewed up bottle. And you can see it has a much finer glue tip here, and so I can control the amount that I'm using. So I'm just going to apply basically just a very, very fine line of glue right to the edge, and I'm spacing this about 1/8 of an inch from the edge of the fabric. So I don't want to use very much. I'm just applying, you know, basically the thinnest, tiniest line of glue that I can. You know, an alternative is you could kind of put a big dot of glue right at the point. That would work too. But I'm going to work one point at a time, just applying about that much fabric glue to, you know, maybe about 1/8 of an inch inside that folded edge. Then I'm going to smooth it down, and I'm going to grab a little scrap of fabric. I'm going to place that fabric down. This is just a little scrap of fabric just to protect both the quilt block and my iron, and I'm just going to press that dry. So any kind of glue basically will start out wet, and then if you hit it with heat, it's going to dry quickly. And so now that's not going to shift, it's not going to wiggle, and I don't have to sit there and wait forever for it to dry. Moving on to the next petal, I'll often shift my pens just so it's out of my way and I have a full petal to work with. You're just going to flip that back, apply glue along that edge, set it down, cover it with a pressing cloth, and give it a press to dry it. So I'm going to work my way all the way around the Dresden plate, securing it in place, and then I'm going to top it with the circle. This is the center circle, and I've taught you how to turn these edges in another video. I'll make sure to link it up so that you can find it easily. So we already have turned these edges, and I'm just going to fold this guy in half very gently. Then I'm going to fold it in half the other way, making sure to line up that first fold and crease it again. And so using those crease lines, I can again simply line those up with the seam lines on the Dresden plate, get nicely centered. I'm going to pen this and glue it down so that way it's not going to shift. If you don't like the gluing method, if that's not something that really appeals to you, you can always just pen it to death, and that will work too. It's not a big deal if you don't like gluing, if you don't like the idea of that, or you don't have glue. Just put a lot of pins in it, and you can see here, just start with maybe one side and the other side, opposite side, and then secure the horizontal and vertical. And then if you still need more pins, you know, go in between each one, and that will work out good. So there's multiple ways that you can secure these appliques. You could even hand baste this in place, so don't feel like you're locked into only one system. Just get them secured, get them in place, and the next step is to stitch around these shapes with our machine so that way they're secured and then our block will be ready to quilt. So now I've moved to my machine and I'm going to secure this Dresden plate down to the background by edge stitching. I'm stitching about 1/8 of an inch from that turned edge of the pointy petals. And I'm doing this just with my regular piecing foot because I have a groove here in the foot that's really handy. An edge stitching foot would probably work great too. You could also play around with moving your needle on your machine just to see if you could get that spacing just right. But you can see this is what we're going for here. Just that nice straight line of stitching, exactly 1/8 of an inch from the edge of the Dresden plate petal. Of course, because we have two different colors of fabric, if you want to, you could break thread with each petal and then have it match. That takes a lot of time though, and that would be a lot of thread breaks. So I'm just chose a dark blue thread and I'm going over it with this dark blue. It's gonna show up on the purple, but hey, that's all right. You know, I think it looks just fine. It completely blends into the blue, but on the purple, it's gonna show up just a bit, and I think that's cute. Another option, if you wanted a completely 100% seamless finish, would be to hand applique this down. And that is just taking a tiny little stitch onto the fold, a tiny little stitch into the background. And if you're interested in that, you want me to shoot a video on that, then I will. Just let me know by posting to the comments below, and I'll shoot a video just for you guys, just to show you how to do this by hand if that's the way you prefer it. So I'm just going to continue buzzing all the way around it. I will also do the exact same thing. I will change thread to green and stitch around the center circle the exact same way. So that's it for this video. I really hope that you enjoyed learning how to piece this 8-petal Dresden plate. You know, this is kind of an unusual shape. I really haven't seen very many Dresden plates that are 8 petals. And the reason why I designed it this way is I wanted bigger shapes so that way we would have more space to go inside and quilt with some really beautiful designs. So I think that definitely fits the bill, and I really enjoyed making this with you today. If you have any questions about this process, please ask in the comments below. I really want to help you learn more about quilting. And if you enjoyed this video, please subscribe to my channel on YouTube so you don't miss the next video in this series where we learn how to machine quilt this cute block together. Until next time, let's go quilt.